Okay, before I start, I want to begin by making an acknowledgement that that those of us at University of British Columbia are hosting this event on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And this is brought to you by the Women's Health Research Cluster, a cluster we started a few years ago. We're a multidisciplinary collaborative network of women's health researchers. Why do we bring such enthusiasm to studying women's health? It's because there's very few female-only studies. This is human and animal. This is animal only. You can see it's only about 6% of at least neuroscience studies that are out there. This is neuroscience and psychiatry, only about 3 to 4%. So it's, we'd like to, given that we're 50% of the population and there are some interesting things in women's health, we should really highlight that a little bit more. We also have, we're very lucky because we have Farida for this talk, but also next week she'll be giving another talk in the Women's Brain Health Virtual Conference Series. So take a look at that if you have not already, and we're very grateful to the sponsors so we could put on that conference. And for today's conversation, if you want to engage on Twitter, there's the handle. The Slido code is 86802. Again, just put Slido into Google and you'll get right on there. And also consider joining our network and supporting us if you so desire. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Farida can share her screen, and I shall introduce her. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Farida because she is really my hero, my scientific hero. I have a few, but Farida is very high up there. I'm not going to say she's number one, even though she is, so don't tell anybody else. So I'm really honored to have her here to present to our community. She's the Joseph Shelton Professor of Neuroscience and Department Chair of the Neuroscience and Experimental Therapeutics. She got her, I'm going to tell you what her doctoral degree is because it's on her bio here, in neurobiology and biopsychology from the University of Rochester in New York. And then she completed her postdoctoral training in Columbia. She has had a federal funded research program for 24 years uninterrupted. That's pretty amazing in this climate these days. Her research focuses, and you'll hear more about this, on the therapeutic potential of IGF in aging females, epigenetic biomarkers. She's designing novel therapies for long-term recovery for stroke. But basically, she's a fellow at the American Heart Association and a member of the inaugural Presidential Impact Fellows at Texas A&M. She does so much service. So she sits on study sections for NIH and for the American Heart Association as well. But she's also very actively involved in mentoring trainees and junior faculty. She founded and is the director of the Women's Health and Neuroscience program at Texas A&M. I'm so jealous. I wish we had a same kind of program here. I wish I was a trainee so I could become a fellow in the Women's Health Neuroscience program. Last month, I think September 1st, she gave a NIH webinar from the Office of Research on Women's Health. I'm again so jealous that America I'm jealous of America for some things, not all things American, but many things American. And her webinar was called Sex and Gender Considerations in Neurology. It was fantastic. I think it's still out there if you would like to look at it. Now, I can talk more about her accolades and awards and what her H-index is and everything, but I always like giving a fun fact about researchers. And so her fun fact that she gave me, and then I'm going to give one that I know about her myself, is that even when she dresses professionally, she's usually wearing sequenced socks inside her boots. And I just added my own little thing, like, who says sequence isn't professional? I mean, seriously. And it's always good to have some fun. I also know we've had many interactions at meetings, and one of our favorite meetings is in Italy. And Italy is well known for many things, including chocolate. One of these meetings is in Torino. And so they have a famous chocolate. It's like Nutella, but much better than Nutella, called, and I'm not going to get this right, but Buongiorno. And I know that she has specifically larger suitcases that she brings to this meeting so she can bring back her fair share of it. So without further ado, I give it over to Farida.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, so Lisa, thank you so much for that introduction. I don't think I could actually top that with my talk, so I may as well just give up. Um, so my talk today is called Sex Differences in Ischemic Stroke and the Effect of Menopause. This is going to be very light on my own research, but it's going to be about information from the literature that I think might be of interest to all of you, because it talks about um, sex differences in a very prominent, very prevalent disease. And I have a fair number of slides, not a lot, but I don't need to go through all of them. So if you need to stop and ask questions, I guess Lisa will curate the questions and decide if you need to interrupt or we can wait for the end. But in any case, I am looking forward to sharing this with you. So, um, so why should we care about sex differences in any disease? And the main reason for that is essentially because we want to reduce health disparities. I think we're all familiar with health disparities across socioeconomic groups, among ethnic communities, and at the very, very basic level, healthcare disparities between men and women. And so this today's talk is really geared towards shining a light on sex differences. And I'm going to use stroke as an example because that's what I study. And very importantly, this last bullet is something I want to leave you with, is that we need to recognize that the same drugs and the same therapies may not be equally effective in men and women. And this is something that is emerging from the basic science data and is entering into clinical trials that may affect the outcome of these trials. So my focus today is stroke. And I have some data to give you an idea of what a prevalent disease this is. There are 15 million strokes that will take place worldwide every year. And 5 million people will die, and 5 million people will be permanently disabled. This is a very significant number, especially when you consider the issue of lost capacity, quality of life, etc. So in the United States, somebody is having a stroke every 40 seconds, and every 4 minutes, somebody dies of a stroke. Because this meeting is being hosted out of Canada, I have a few bullets about Canada. It turns out that in Canada, every 7 minutes, a Canadian dies of heart disease or stroke. So this is a worldwide issue. This is not restricted just to the US. And in fact, the issue and the burden of stroke is much higher in developing countries. So I'm assuming that not everybody here is a stroke researcher. So the next few slides are to simply give you a little primer on stroke so that when I get to the part about sex differences, you can appreciate the differences a little better. So there are two major types of stroke. Essentially, stroke is when blood supply to the brain is interrupted. This can happen if the artery is blocked by a clot, and so you have what's called an ischemic stroke. Essentially, you're completely reducing the supply of oxygen and glucose to neurons, brain cells. A hemorrhagic stroke, on the other hand, is a condition where the individual will have a weakness in the blood vessel that will result in the blood vessel rupturing, and therefore blood flows out into the brain parenchyma and clots. And that's also dangerous. In fact, hemorrhagic strokes are much more fatal than ischemic strokes. So even though only about 13% of all strokes occur as hemorrhagic strokes, 1/3 of all stroke deaths are hemorrhagic strokes. So it is very lethal. But we're going to focus today on ischemic strokes because they are by far the more prevalent. 87% of all strokes are ischemic strokes. So what happens when a stroke occurs in the brain? The brain cells are essentially starved of oxygen and glucose. And the brain is one of the largest and most heavy consumers of glucose in the body. even the slightest amount of deprivation of glucose will cause neurons to die. So you have very rapid cell death. Approximately 2 million brain cells will die every minute after a stroke, which increases the possibility of permanent brain damage, disability, or even death. And so recognizing the symptoms of stroke and acting fast is really critical for limiting disabilities. And I want to make the case that understanding these sex differences will be very important, because sometimes the symptoms of a stroke between men and women can be very different. Shown over here is a fairly typical PSA of how to spot a stroke. You know, the drooping face, the weakness of the limbs, speech difficulty, etc. So why is the loss of brain cells so devastating? For those of you on this Zoom that are not neuroscientists, let me just say that the brain has a poor ability to regenerate compared to other organs. Say, for example, the skin. The skin heals rapidly and nicely. Even other organs like the liver will also regenerate, but the brain doesn't do that very successfully. Some parts of the brain do have the ability to add new neurons, but the ability of these new neurons to eventually result in a recovery of old behaviors still needs to be evaluated. And it's made worse by the fact that the brain is a very specialized organ. So if I were to ask you to close your eyes and imagine a Parkinson's disease patient or a patient with Alzheimer's disease, I think you would quickly visualize, in the first case, somebody with a gait problem, you know, a fine motor incoordination. In the latter, Alzheimer's disease, it would be a person with a poor cognitive ability and recall of recent events. But stroke is tricky. Stroke can have a wide variety of symptoms simply depending upon which area of the brain is where the blood supply has been interrupted. And then worse, over time, you can have secondary degeneration in the brain. So a stroke in, say, a primary motor cortex can eventually result in other types of secondary degeneration and result in neuropsychiatric conditions like depression, epilepsy, cognitive impairment. Stroke actually, along with TBI, is among the leading causes of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. Please don't focus on this slide. It's just here to tell you that there are just a huge number of events that occur when the brain is deprived of oxygen. You lose glucose and oxygen, and suddenly all energy systems defined here by ATP-dependent systems are lost. And you end up with sometimes irreversible injury. I use this slide for other courses, so I don't want you to get into the nitty-gritty here. So what therapies do we have for stroke? Now, most stroke therapies are aimed at removing the clot, okay? This over here. And that is so that you can reestablish circulation. So the only FDA-approved drug treatment is a thrombolytic, which is TPA, tissue plasminogen activator. And essentially what that does is it degrades the clot. It melts it down. And by doing that, you now allow blood to go past that clot, that blockage, and therefore reperfuse the tissue. What's the limitation? The limitation is that it is only effective within a very narrow time frame. So a very large study supported by the NINDS several decades ago showed that giving TPA to a patient after 4.5 hours after the first symptom of stroke is a problem, because it is so effective in degrading the clot, it also starts to weaken the blood vessels. So there is a possibility of the ischemic stroke now becoming a hemorrhagic stroke, which, as I mentioned earlier, is very often lethal and much more devastating. So it has a very short time window when it can be offered to the patient safely. What does that mean? It means that people who did not identify their symptoms as a stroke, who live far from a medical center and did not get there in time, are essentially not given this treatment because they're not in the safe window. And I should also point out that even if you do get the TPA, it doesn't always result in a recovery of function. The other treatment that is becoming more popular and was recently standardized in a series of very high-profile studies is a treatment called endovascular therapy. This is where you essentially mechanically remove the clot. This is such a straightforward approach, right? You have something blocking your artery, so you go in there, you grab a hold of it and remove it. That gets you around the issue of putting in an IV proteolytic degrader, which might affect your blood vessels down the line. So this treatment, this EV treatment, is actually quite effective, but that also has some limitations. First of all, the clot has to be in a fairly large vessel. Otherwise, you can't put the little catheter in there and actually grab the clot. It requires a fairly good medical center with fast imaging facilities to be able to show where the clot is located. And you need a board certified surgeon to be able to do this. So not every place that offers stroke treatment actually can do this. So with that background, I want to get into the meat of today's talk, and that is sex differences. So I've got a few bullets over here, and I'm just going to introduce you to sex differences in each of these particular domains and see and hopefully show you how that all adds up in leading to health disparities, especially for older women. So let's talk about the incidence first. So I mentioned to you in the first slide that stroke is the 5th leading cause of death among men, but it is the 3rd leading cause of death in women. In fact, with heart disease, coupled with heart disease, it is the #1 killer of women. Approximately 55,000 more women than men will have a stroke every year, and they're more likely to be disabled after they've had their stroke. And in the US, they account for 63% of all stroke deaths. This number in the 2015 data has fallen to about 58%. So it's still a little higher in women, but we are headed in what I like to think of as the right direction. Now, here's a graph that I think shows you the interaction between stroke incidence in women and how that is affected by age. It's from the work of Dr. Elkind, and this data shows you, age in deciles on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you have the prevalence ratio. What that means is the number of women with stroke divided by the number of men with stroke at that age group. So anything that is below 1 would mean that fewer women have strokes at that age. Anything above 1 would mean that more women have strokes than men. So if you take a look at this 45 to 54 bracket, you see that the number is below 1. Fewer women will have a stroke as compared to men. When you get to 55 to 64, that advantage disappears. Now, men and women have a similar risk for stroke. And it's very interesting for those of you who study endocrinology that this corresponds very closely to the early menopausal age, especially in North America. And then every decile after that, the number of women with a stroke increases much more as compared to men. So clearly something happens at menopause after which the increase or the risk for stroke in women is much higher. Now, this actually may occur much earlier than we think. This is a study that was done by Amy Tofigi a few years ago, where she showed that even in the 45 to 54 age bracket, already more women are likely to have a stroke as compared to men. Again, this brackets the perimenopausal age, where significant changes take place in hormones and other risk factors for stroke. So why is this such a big deal? So I like this graph over here because it's very dramatic in its depiction of how life expectancy and the age of menopause splits so very far. So on the x-axis, you actually have time in years, and starting from the 1850s to 2000. And on the y-axis, you have actual age, individual's age. Now, the age of menopause is very similar across this 150 odd years. Typically in the US, it's about 51 years of age. Menopause starts a little earlier if you live closer to the equator, a little later if the further you live from the equator. But the number of years in the menstruating age remains the same. That's because menstruation occurs earlier near the equator. But look at the graph that shows you life expectancy. In the 1850s, a woman was lucky if she actually lived long enough to be menopausal. One of the most critical reasons for that, obviously, is childbirth, etc., where because of the medical care available at the time, there was likely to be a greater mortality. But as you head towards the 2000s, women are living much longer, and the average age is close to 79 or so in North America. So essentially, a woman will live in a menopausal state for almost 1/3 of her life. This is a condition where ovarian hormones are reduced, and we do not fully understand the implications of that for chronic diseases as well as acute diseases such as stroke. And it's, I want to point out one fact over here that in the earlier graph, I showed you the prevalence of stroke in males, females versus males. And what this shows you is the incidence of stroke across time. So even though women have a protection in their younger ages, few strokes occur at this time. The strokes mainly occur among the elderly population. So at a time in their lives when strokes are more prevalent, more women are likely to get a stroke. So what are the risk factors for women? What I'm showing you over here is essentially risk factors for anybody, and that is advanced age. Hypertension is a leading risk factor for stroke across the globe. A previous stroke is a risk factor for a later stroke. Diabetes, cholesterol, and then cigarette smoking. Some of these are lifestyle-related risk factors and can be modified. And then atrial fibrillation, which is a biological condition which actually promotes clot formation in the heart and can therefore result in a clot leaving the heart, leaving the atria, and then getting lodged into a brain vessel. So what about women? How do these factors operate in women? Now, some of these factors are, of course, common to both sexes, but in this slide here, I'm showing you some unique factors that are only going to affect women, the first of which is pregnancy. Pregnancy can also create a situation where strokes might occur. Similarly, menopause, which is down here, and especially hormone therapy after menopause, which has also been shown to increase the risk for stroke. Then cigarette smoking. Although men are more likely to smoke, the incidence of cigarette smoking is increasing among women, especially in their 50s. And if they're on birth control medication or other hormonal treatment, then cigarette smoking increases or amplifies their risk. Women are more likely to have diabetes or develop diabetes after age 45. And then atrial fibrillation, which is a very interesting risk factor. It occurs more often in men, but it is more often a risk for stroke in women because the most commonly used drug to control atrial fibrillation or reduce clot formation was underprescribed to women because it would lead to hemorrhaging, which has its own complications. And so because they're underprescribed the drug, they're more likely to end up with clots and more likely to have a stroke. So this is one of those interesting intersections between a biological risk factor that gets amplified more in one sex, even though it is more prevalent in the other sex. Hypertension, this is a leading risk factor for stroke. And what this graph shows you is that around menopause, again over here, 55 to 64 and thereafter, women are much more likely to have hypertension as compared to men. So this would also be a risk factor for that group. Menopause is a very interesting risk factor for women. This study was a meta-analysis published last year, which showed that the earlier a woman went through a natural menopause, the greater the risk for a first cardiovascular event, either a heart attack or a stroke. So there's something about the act of transitioning to a different hormonal profile because of menopause that seems to affect stroke risk. Outcomes. So women tend to have greater post-stroke disability, and they're more likely to be admitted to a nursing facility and more likely to have greater mental impairment. Now, there is some amount of confound to this data because women tend to get their strokes very late because they live longer. And so it's quite possible that their severe strokes are because they're getting them when they're older, there's less ability to compensate and to recover from those strokes. But there are a few studies that have suggested that the poor outcomes in women are not just related to the onset of stroke at older ages and will also be noticed even after you adjust for age. So their outcomes for stroke, including death, are much higher or much more severe in women. They're also much less likely to get the only FDA approved drug, which is an intravenous treatment of TPA. And this is true not only of the major medical centers, but also the community hospitals. And it's a very interesting issue because there is no doubt that if a person came in presenting with a stroke, every effort would be made to give them this drug. So why is there this stroke? Why is there this sex difference in even giving them the treatment? Is it the case that women get to the hospital later? I mentioned to you that after a 4.5 hour window, TPA cannot safely be given to anybody. And so if you get to the medical facility very late, you will be outside of this safe window. And this is, there is some truth to this option. So women, because they get their strokes when they're older, they may at this point be living on their own. They're empty nesters, they may have survived their spouses. As a result, when they get a stroke, they either cannot quickly request medical attention or they are unable to do so. Could it be that ED physicians, emergency department physicians, will see men faster than women? And there is also some evidence for this, not because of any prejudice, but because of this last bullet here called atypical presentations. That is, men and women might not present with strokes in the same way, and it may prevent them from being accurately diagnosed for stroke treatment. So let's talk about the symptoms, because that can certainly play into your ability to get medical attention. I showed you this graph before. The most typical, most well-known signs of a stroke are, where your face suddenly appears to droop on one side, or you have trouble moving your limbs, or your speech is slurred, you have saliva drooling out of your mouth. And that's usually a sign that you need to get some attention. Now, while the majority of men and women will show the traditional stroke symptoms that I just mentioned, women are much more likely to report non-traditional symptoms, and I'm just going to label them in a basket called weakness. They're likely to report a somatic cluster such as they feel nauseous, they have a headache, they have neck pain or face pain. And sometimes this can result in not being considered a stroke patient. So in a study that was published about a decade ago now, that looked at 449 cases of a first ischemic stroke, of which more than half were women, women were more likely to present with a symptom of generalized weakness or mental status change, which means they felt confused, anxious, and worried. Whereas men presented with more objectively quantifiable symptoms such as paresthesia in their limbs, ataxia, or double vision. And their neurological signs also showed some differences, including, again, some that I mentioned earlier, with women presenting with fatigue, disorientation, and fever. So here is a I think where some of the issues may start with under-prescribing women TPA. That is, if you're in an emergency department and you're sitting in a corner there, holding your head, and you have a headache, you report that you're anxious and worried, you might not be seen as a stroke patient. Whereas somebody who's in the emergency department, whose speech is slurred, who's drooling, etc., may be seen more stereotypically as a stroke patient and would therefore be rushed towards a cath lab where the appropriate therapies would begin. So perhaps this is where the what might actually complicate the issue of treatment. And that brings me to therapies, which I think is the area that we really need to focus on in terms of our research as well as medical practice. So as I mentioned earlier, men are more likely to get TPA than women. Black women are less likely to receive TPA than white women. And women are more likely to not get TPA because they have hypertension, which is an exclusion for TPA treatment as well. So I made the point several slides ago that menopause increases the prevalence, the risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. And we know that the use of hormone therapy is common at menopause. So the question is, does this help or does this hurt stroke and the risk for stroke? And I'm going to show you data that is now actually a couple of decades old, but it is a landmark study called the Women's Health Initiative. This was a large-scale effort to understand how estrogen and estrogen plus progesterone replacement would affect the health of women. And they took otherwise healthy postmenopausal women who had no pre-existing cardiovascular disease. But I do want to point out that many of them had risk factors for CVD, hypertension, overweight, metabolic syndrome. And they were treated sequentially and blindly. It was a double-blind study, given either a placebo or estrogen plus progesterone. This was a very, very large study. It enrolled thousands of women across the country, funded by the NIH and by Wyeth Ayerst, that makes the leading estrogen therapy, Premarin and Prempro. And the outcomes were cardiac health and stroke. And for today, I'll just talk about stroke. So the data shows that it increased ischemic stroke by 44%. It had no effect on hemorrhagic stroke, but increased ischemic stroke, which is the more prevalent kind of stroke. And this was actually seen in all age groups in women with and without hypertension or any prior history of CVD. So who participated in this study? And if you look at this column here called characteristics, the women ranged all the way from 50 to 79. This is a very broad age group, and essentially they only enrolled people who were not currently on hormone therapy. The reason being that if a woman on hormone therapy ended up in the placebo group, she would know right away that she was in the placebo group, and that would no longer make it a double-blind study. So while that may not be a big deal for women in their 50s and late 50s, a woman in 79 years of age who has never sought hormone therapy, getting hormone therapy for the first time in this study was of concern. And here's what they found. They found that it increased um, the hazard ratio for cardiovascular disease as compared to the women who received placebo. And it also increased strokes in this population. So the cardiac outcomes were very bad, and this study was actually prematurely halted because the treatment arms resulted in a worse outcome. So let's talk about, it didn't work as a prophylactic treatment. It didn't decrease women's risk for stroke. Would it actually be helpful if they got hormone therapy after a stroke, that is secondary prevention? And here I'll talk about the HER study and the WEST study. And essentially the data here also is not promising. It actually increased the risk of stroke in the first 6 months of treatment among women who had a prior stroke and got hormone treatment. They also had worse neurological effects, and essentially there was no benefit for estrogen. It may be possible that in women who have established vascular disease, hormone therapy is not going to be a good option. It leaves open the possibility that treatment ahead or in the perimenopausal period or the early menopausal period could be therapeutic. So in this group here, between 50 and 59, in post hoc measures after the WHI study, they found that this group did not sustain cardiovascular risk factors such as thickening of the intima, etc. So it may be useful taken very early, but clearly not when it's taken very late. And the timing of hormone treatment clearly has received a lot of attention. But for those of us who are interested in developing stroke therapies, it does mean that we have a lot of work to do. We need therapies for populations who will not be eligible for TPA or for the new endovascular therapy, or as adjuncts for the current therapies, and to further improve stroke therapy, even for those people who get the TPA. We know now that drugs may work only on specific populations, such as age. It may work in adults, but not elderly people. It may work better in one racial group versus another, and of course, biological sex. So one size will not fit all when it comes to stroke therapy. So I'm going to keep a little eye on the time over here and talk to you about sort of an object lesson. So here is a picture of what happens after a stroke. I showed you this early part where cells just simply cannot cope with the loss of oxygen and glucose, and they start to die. And then you have a late occurring apoptosis, you have inflammation, you have some amount of repair, and then you can have secondary either recovery or neurodegeneration. And each of these points over here represents a therapeutic target that we could use to improve the outcomes for stroke. The anecdote that I want to tell is the story of tyrolizumab mesylate. This is, the drug was called Lazaroids, and I'm showing you pictures of Larry Cahill and Ed Hall. They actually co-authored a review article on the failed trials with this wonder drug. And actually Ed Hall was one of the scientists who developed this drug. So this drug was very, very effective for stroke in its preclinical studies. And so they took it to clinical trials. And there were 6 clinical trials. And trial 1 showed that there was reduced mortality and a much better outcome on quality of living scales in males. In fact, mortality was 0, but only in males. It simply had no effect on females, good or bad. However, because of how the study was designed, they had to club all the data together and they had to come out saying it had no effect. that there was no statistically significant outcome. Subsequent trials also failed to consider males and females separately. And I want to go back here and remind you of these preclinical studies. All the preclinical studies were done in males. And this is a really important takeaway, to realize that even in the preclinical part, both sexes need to be involved. They should not both be involved first time in a clinical trial, because that doesn't give you the ability to stratify for sex as a covariate in these clinical trials. As a result, the FDA refused to approve this drug and it was abandoned. And so a drug that is actually very effective in males is simply not available, and that is tragic. So we know from our preclinical studies that the number of drugs that people have tested, if you look at PubMed and do stroke neuroprotection, you will get hundreds and hundreds of papers. Very few of these drugs will have moved to the testing stage. And part of it is because the preclinical studies may not be using the right kind of animal. They may use young animals, while we know stroke is much more prevalent in older individuals. They may not use animals that have comorbid conditions like diabetes and hypertension, which is very common in the stroke population, or they simply don't look for long enough outcomes. Very acute studies are done, whereas in the patient world, the longer issue is, can you recover function? And very few of these studies do that, although we are headed in that direction. So in the stroke field, there is a document called the STAIR recommendation, where investigators are encouraged to include both sexes, to use ages, young and old, to use comorbid conditions, to improve our ability to translate this. I'm going to show you one slide, which is a summary data from the work of Louise McCullough and from my lab. And both of us are very interested in sex differences in stroke. And we've shown in several papers that there are drugs that will work effectively only in one sex or the other. And it's quite possible that going forward, we will see this true of not just stroke, but other disease conditions as well. And it would be good to build this into any proposal for phase 1 trials for these particular drugs. And I want to end actually with a shout out to my favorite professional group, and that is the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences. You might recognize one of these pictures. Lisa Galea is the president-elect of this society. And if you do research or you are looking at a biomedical condition or a disease that occurs more often in one sex or the other, or if you're not aware whether it occurs more often in one sex or the other, I highly recommend this group. This society doesn't focus on any one particular discipline. It's not just neuroscientists or cardiovascular people or cancer biologists. It's anybody whose research or interests focus on sex differences. I learn a lot from going to this meeting. And I'm going to end over here to thank you for your attention, and I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Now I can't find my unmute button. Okay, so I have some questions. We only have one question so far on Slido, so I'm just going to remind you it's 86807 if you want to ask questions. And the question is interesting because I'll give you my version of the question and then give you the question. So, well, I'll give her the question first and then give you my version of it. So how can the training, I think part of the problem is this inability to recognize that there might be different symptoms in women than men. And I often get really amused by the fact that we call them, for a variety of different diseases, we call them atypical in women. They're atypical, even though they might be typical for one sex versus the other. So the question is, how can the training of healthcare professionals shift away from the persistent paradigm of women's hysteria, right? Because you said they they present with anxiety often, and confusion, and I'm not really sure, I just don't feel well. So how can they shift away from the persistent paradigm of women's hysteria to better recognize medical symptoms?
Okay, so that's a great question. One of the ways that we're trying to do it at my institution is making sure that we introduce this into the medical curriculum very early. So for example, I give a lecture to the first year medical school students that is simply called Sex Differences in Neurologic Diseases. And I do talk a little more about stroke than I do other diseases, although Parkinson's disease is an excellent example of where the risk is in the opposite direction. Many more men will have Parkinson's disease as compared to women. But in the case of stroke, the ability to recognize symptoms that may be unique to one sex or the other is going to be critical, especially because of the limited treatment options, the time-bound treatment options, and the fact that we're talking about an organ that will define so many aspects of your life. And so getting this into the medical curriculum is really important. But I do the same thing for grad students as well. I give a similar kind of lecture to graduate students. And there, of course, the path for that lecture is a little different. That is, how would you design your experiment so that you are correctly testing whether your therapy is effective in both sexes? Now, in preclinical work, symptoms are a little bit harder to diagnose as being different in males and females because we create very similar strokes in males and females. But even in males and female rats and mice, it's very obvious that in young males, the same kind of stroke results in very bad outcomes for a male mouse or a rat as compared to a young female mouse or a rat. And so we have the opportunity already to understand how there might be sex differences, maybe not in the type of symptom, but in the severity of the same symptoms. So bringing a sort of a nuanced understanding of medical school training, as well as in developing experimental designs for graduate students, I think is going to be key to this process. I am hoping that in a decade or so, this talk will never be necessary.
Yeah, I hope so. But I was wondering, what do you think about, there's more questions now, but what do you think about, because people don't always remember, right, from their one lecture that they might have had. What about, and I thought that there was some interesting data coming out of Boston where they were doing some, they had some kind of digital, like, is this symptom, is it this symptom, is it this symptom, to sort of lead the emergency room doctors into, and what sex do I have in front of me? And so that might cue them to think, hey, this, do you know any data on that, or?
So I do know that Marjorie Jenkins, who used to be at Texas Tech University and was at the FDA, and I do believe she's moved to South Carolina now, has been championing the idea that we need to make sure that women's health and sex differences is part of the licensing exams for students, and that needs to be part of their continuing medical education, and it should show up as part of their differential diagnosis. So, we've learned the hard way that you can't just consider children small adults and just reduce their dose. It hasn't worked out well for children. And we continue to do the same thing between males and females, that we take the same drug because it was tested on males, and so you just ratio it for body weight, and that should work for females. And that has also resulted in some rather serious consequences. The Ambion story, for example, springs to mind. So it is becoming part of the differential that students should be using, but it is slow moving, and it needs to become much more part of the curriculum. And I know that the ORWH is trying very hard to make sure that that happens through their educational modules. They've got modules for sex differences in immunology, in neurology, and cardiovascular medicine. So hopefully those will form sort of the springboard for making sure that it gets into how you use this information in clinical practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need it. We need like a multi-pronged effect. That's my, maybe I'm just getting irritated with how slow everything takes for people to realize how important, critically important this is. So we've had a couple of talks on the WHI study and how it's not the best study for hormone therapy. So we have a question from the audience about that. And I know you actually did couch your description of it really well, I think, but just to underline it for other people. So weren't the cardiovascular findings of the WHR later proven due to the prevalence of high risk factors within that sample?
Yes, there were multiple reasons why the study eventually came out the way it did. So the whole study was based on this idea in the literature, usually from retrospective studies, showing that women who were on hormone therapy tend to have a lower incidence of cardiovascular disease and stroke and dementia. And so this needed to be tested in a very rigorous, systematic way, which is what the WHI was supposed to do. And I think that's where we started to see the differences between the populations that were recruited for the WHI versus the populations in the retrospective study. In the retrospective studies, it's quite possible that women who were taking hormone therapy were very actively engaged in other aspects of their health, exercise, eating well, etc. And so it became a subgroup of women who were naturally primed to have healthier outcomes. Whereas in the WHI, any woman who agreed to be enrolled and was blindly assigned to one or another group. So yes, they ended up with people who had underlying health conditions that would have put them at risk for cardiovascular disease, especially hypertension and especially obesity. The other thing that the study did is they couldn't take, as I mentioned earlier, they couldn't take anybody who was on active hormone therapy. They had to take people who had never sought it. Now, if you never sought hormone therapy, it's likely that you were just powering through it, or you didn't have menopausal symptoms and therefore didn't need the hormone therapy in the same way. Yeah. So I think the ad hoc or the post hoc analyses have been very interesting, looking at the younger population, which is 50 to 59, versus the older populations. We're starting to see that taking it early really did not increase the bad outcomes.
Right. I really like that point when you made that point. Somebody also says, sounds like what we went through with heart attacks in women, because of course the symptoms are also quite different for heart attacks in women versus men. So the difference is there now about 15 years ago. We've had a longer time for the society to realize that heart attack symptoms can be quite different in men versus women. So I guess it's just, we need the time. We need the time to get into the collective psyche for people to realize that stroke symptoms could be quite different too, manifest quite differently.
Yes. Actually, the cardiovascular literature is somewhat ahead.
Yeah, they are.
A lot ahead of the stroke field. And it did take them a while to recognize this as well. So I'm optimistic that stroke healthcare practitioners will be doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think what also, at least in Canada, the Heart and Stroke Foundation has started to even have grants specifically for women's health. And I think that's one of the messages I like to harp on about, is that we don't have enough studies out there for understanding hormone therapy and menopause, and how that, you even mentioned that too, about how that might differ. What about the prevalence of stroke and the effective treatments for transgender individuals? Because a number of them are taking hormone therapy. So is there a greater risk to develop strokes?
That's a really great question. And I'm very sorry to say, I don't have anything to tell you, because those studies are just beginning to be done. And they are being done in the case of heart disease. In terms of stroke, I don't know anybody who's actually looking at that population. And because that would represent a population that is not only actively exposed to gonadal steroids, but will also have it would be interesting to know what kind of symptoms are they more likely to show. Will they be more male typical if they are transgendered males, or will they be more female typical? And again, we don't know anything about this in terms of stroke yet. The population is small, and so that makes it much more difficult to understand their health needs in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we really need more national studies, I think, to get those populations.
There is one study that was done at Stanford a few years ago, where they looked at symptoms of heart attacks in uh, across genders, is the way I should put it. And they found that individuals who identified as male tended to show more male typical symptoms, no matter what their biology was. And those that identified as female or more feminine showed more female-like symptoms. Again, this may or may not correspond to their biological sex, or chromosomal sex is how I should say it.
Great, thank you. Can you speak quickly on the sex differences you've seen with microRNA therapy studies? That was really interesting.
Yeah. Yes, we've been looking at microRNAs because they are epigenetic modifiers. They are found in all cells, all body fluids, and they can do a lot of mischief, just like estrogen, actually. And I thought that because the estrogen wasn't neuroprotective, perhaps the microRNA would be. So at this point, we have published on 2 microRNA, and a third story is currently very close to being sent out. What we found is that one of them, MIRLET7F, very powerful little microRNA, only works to improve stroke outcomes in young females, had no effect in males, and actually had a slightly toxic effect in middle-aged female rats, which was the group we were trying to improve. So that we had to scratch that off the list. And then we moved to another one called MIR363, and we've actually published 3 papers on that, and looked at not only short-term outcomes, but also long-term outcomes like post-stroke depression and post-stroke cognitive impairment. And what we found in that particular microRNA, it will work in females, young and middle-aged, but it will not work in males, either young or middle-aged. The last one that we are currently working on, I'm pleased to say, is actually going to work in everybody, we think. And we're trying to figure out the mechanism of action, and we're trying to see what the long-term consequences are, because I very strongly believe that we can't just look at the acute 2-day, 5-day effect. Stroke victims worry about the rest of their lives and their functionality for the rest of their lives. So we are really pursuing the 3-month, 6-month time frame for these studies.
Very nice, because those secondary consequences are really important.
Yeah.
There is another question, even though I have one, but I can talk to you anytime. Would AI be a better screening tool in emergency departments, do you think?
Artificial intelligence or aromatic? Okay,
Yeah.
artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, that is a really good question. And I think, okay, this is a personal opinion. AI will give you what you put in.
Right.
And so when we know all the variables, when we know all of the confounds, etc., then we will have a very accurate answer. Right now, we're still figuring out what those are, and so experience is going to matter. And we just need a way to document all of this experience and feed it into AI programs. But yes.
Yeah, that's, I think, a good answer, because even if in the program, I know, you know, it should take everything, but what if it doesn't even take biological sex, which is quite possible. Okay, we're at 1 p.m., but I have one quick question to put you on the spot in front of everyone that you can't see anyways, it's fine. What do you think about mandating, maybe that's too strong a term, but for clinical trials, you know, your example of Lazaroid is well taken. And if they had considered sex in their primary outcome, then it was possible that it would have been approved for men, but not for women, or males and not for females. Do you think it's the right move to start mandating biological sex in primary outcomes for randomized controlled trials?
Um,
This is Canada,
yeah. um, so let me turn it on its head. Would you mandate that for ethnicity?
Yeah.
And my take on it, the way I would interpret it, is um, any biological variable that would affect your outcome would be very good to include in the
Absolutely.
data.
Yeah.
And if chromosomal sex is a variable, we should be thinking about it. For women, if they're menopausal and not on ET, HT, that should be a variable. Young women who are taking birth control medication, all of these things, any variable that strengthens the output, your predictive output, should be taken into consideration. In a number of ways, we do operate on stereotypes in medical care, right? You have X, Y, and Z symptoms. The odds are very high you have this. And it's helpful, but in sometimes it can take you down the wrong path as well. So if sex is a modifying covariable, we should pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for answering that in a very politically astute way. All right. Well, thank you very much, Shori. We're 2 minutes over, but join me. And I know you can't make any noise, but you can do reactions, I think. So if you can, please give.
Oh, look at that.
Clap.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to this, Farida, and I look forward to your talk in the conference next week too. So thank you for being such a good sport about it. And thank you all for joining us.
You're very welcome. Bye.
Bye.